VITA radium suppositories. Yeah. What I've discovered while making this list is that after radium was discovered, people became obsessed with it. Like the Gma and Frank's Red Hot commercials, they put that on everything. VITA radium suppositories were developed as a way of relieving our digestive systems a la radioactive material. According to this ad, these suppositories were guaranteed to contain radium, which is exactly the opposite of what we want to see on the back of canisters today. People believed that radium had miracle effects when it came to the human body, saying that they made you glow, because they did. These pills were to be inserted into the rectum so they could be dissolved and devoured by the entire body. According to the ad, and I quote, "Every tissue, every organ of the body is bombarded by its health-giving electric atoms." They also implied that it would increase libido. Oh wow. But the only thing that rose to the expectation was the death toll.
Moving on, at number 9 we have the DUGWAY Proving Ground. Located in Utah, the DUGWAY Proving Ground is the main biological and chemical weapons testing site for the US Army. During 1949 to 1952, 4 major types of radiation weapons tests took place there. First, we got the cluster bombs. Cluster bombs weighed about a ton each, and they were dropped from airplanes flying at 20,000 feet. They then would explode when they reached 800 feet above the ground, spreading radioactive particles everywhere. These tests released between 1,500 to 30,000 curies of radiation each. Then we have the small pellet tests. Again, this involved dropping small radioactive pellets over the area from a high altitude. Then we have the radioactive specks. Basically, a dust generator would fly over the area and spew radioactive specks all over that area. They also tested exploding radioactive metal in different shapes to see what would spread the contamination the best. Each test released about 100 curies of radiation. In our 8th spot today we have the abandoned hospital in Brazil. Now we'll be talking about an abandoned hospital site in Brazil that used to perform radiation therapy for cancer patients. On September 13th in 1987, a bunch of individuals broke into the abandoned hospital and stole some parts from a teletherapy unit, thinking it would be worth some money. Little did they know that they took home something highly radioactive. That night, upon bringing it home, the 2 men became very sick and threw up. In the following days, the 2 men became worse and worse. One of the men actually had his hand swell and he had to get it partially amputated. Little did they know what was causing this. While this was all happening, they gave this radioactive piece of equipment to a number of different people. In fact, one of the guys even dismantled it, spreading cesium all over a large area. In the end, 4 people died as a result of this incident, and 250 others were injured from exposure to radioactive contamination. A cleanup crew was sent to decontaminate the area. Topsoil was removed in several areas and a number of houses were demolished. To this day, it's said to be one of the world's worst nuclear disasters and one of the world's worst radiological incident. In our 7th spot, we have HANFORD site. Located in Washington, D.C., the HANFORD site is said to be one of the world's most radioactive places. So during the Cold War, the US used this site as its main plutonium production facility for their nuclear weapons. In the end, they produced enough plutonium for around 60,000 nuclear weapons, including the plutonium that was used in the Fat Man bomb that was dropped on Nagasaki in 1945. Now this place has since been decommissioned, but still contains about 60% of high-level radioactive waste. Most of the waste has been buried underground, but that wasn't a good decision because large areas of groundwater have since become contaminated. Coming in at number 6, we have d'Aubervilliers, Paris. During the 1920s to 1930s, 2 individuals, Frederick and Irene Joliet Curie, conducted a number of studies on radioactivity in this area. In particular, they were experimenting with salts of radium-226. Later on, the French army took over these experiments, and they seriously contaminated the fort. In the 1990s, 61 barrels of cesium-137 and radium-226 were found stored there, as well as about 160,000 gallons of contaminated soil. Over the years, they have tried to decontaminate the area, but in 2006, more contaminated areas were uncovered. People in the area were being exposed to radioactivity and they didn't even know it. In fact, a high percentage of people living in the surrounding area were found to have cancer. Although they deny that this site has anything to do with it, it seems quite obvious that it does. We are now at our 5th and halfway mark with ENEWETAK Island. This island is part of the Marshall Islands in the Pacific Ocean. In 1946 up until 1958, the US government conducted 67 nuclear tests in the Marshall Islands. In 1951, the first ever hydrogen bomb was tested there. As a result, a number of atolls got contaminated, including including ENEWETAK. In fact, it's said that the Marshall Islands to this day are still more radioactive than Chernobyl and Fukushima. Isn't that insane? So when testing the soil, researchers found that the island had toxic levels 10 to 1,000 times higher than the soil in Fukushima, and it's about 10 times more toxic than the soil found in Chernobyl. On top of that, the government said that this is a cause for great concern. The US government had to relocate an entire population because it was exposing them to cancer and other illnesses due to the radiation. But people still live there despite this huge concern. In 1980, hundreds of people gathered on this island and participated in a radioactive cleanup, but still, the levels on this island are highly unsafe. Coming in at number 4, we have RONGELAP Atoll. Surprise, surprise! Another dangerously radioactive atoll located on the Marshall Islands. Researchers have found that this island has the highest levels of external gamma radiation than all of the islands they examined in the study. Soil samples from the area also exposed that they have high concentrations of radioactive isotopes. Not only that, but researchers also found that the fruits on the islands contained more cesium-137 than is permitted by safety standards. And some of the islands also contained more cesium-137 than Chernobyl ever had. In our third spot today, we have SELLAFIELD, United Kingdom. This is another place that has been given the name one of the world's most radioactive places. Back in the day, during the Cold War, Sellafield was the site where weapon-grade nuclear materials were produced for the UK's nuclear weapon program. However, in 1957, one of the wind-scale pipes caught on fire and 11 tons of uranium was on fire for 3 days. As a result, radioactive material started spreading across the Lake District. It was deemed Britain's worst nuclear accident. On top of that, no one evacuated and no one received iodine pills. In fact, some people didn't even know about the fire. They tried to keep it all hush-hush, and workers were just told to keep on working. That was until they found that golf courses, milk, and chickens, among other things, were getting contaminated. To this day, the plant releases around 2.3 million gallons of contaminated waste into the sea on a daily basis. In fact, this has made the Irish Sea the most radioactive sea in the world. Moving on to number 2, we have the Siberian Chemical Combine. This is another place contaminated by high levels of radiation. Located in Russia, this was one of the production facilities used to produce nuclear products for the Soviet nuclear weapons program. But after the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991, the facility stopped its production of plutonium and uranium. But to this day, this combine keeps on contaminating underground waters. This has to do with the explosion that took place on April 6, 1993. As a result of the explosion, tens of thousands of people were exposed to high levels of radiation and contaminated air, water, and soil. In fact, it's said that 10 grams of plutonium is released into the atmosphere there each year. In 2008, a study of the area found increased levels of plutonium and cesium-137 in soils and water samples, suggesting the plant is still leaking. And in our number 1 spot today, we have the Bikini Atoll. This is another atoll located in the Marshall Islands. Turns out that depending on how long you stay there, you could get exposed to as much radiation as you would get from 1 to 64 chest x-rays. That's insane. So in 1954, this area was the site for the US's largest hydrogen bomb test. The blast from this bomb was thousands of times more powerful as the bombs dropped on Japan during World War II. As a result, Bikini Island is said to have the highest levels of radiation in all of the Marshall Islands. In fact, in 1946, residents were forced to relocate, so they were actually shipped around to a number of different islands. They kept moving these people around because of lack of water and food sources. Then in the 1960s, the government said that the islands were safe to live on again, and they were no longer radioactive, which was not the case, and they soon found the levels of radiation were still dangerously high, so everyone had to leave again. In fact, this location is said to be more radioactive than Chernobyl and Fukushima.
At number 10 now, with the HANFORD site, USA. In Washington state lies HANFORD site, where in 1943 a nuclear reactor was responsible for producing the plutonium used in America's first nuclear bombs. The decades of production that followed was done in very unsafe conditions by today's standards, and a lot of radioactive material was leaked into the surrounding air and river. In fact, an estimated 53 million US gallons of radioactive waste was left in the tanks, and contaminated groundwater spread for up to 200 miles around. In fact, this one site alone is thought to contain about 2/3 of America's radioactive waste.
Number 9. Radioactive TOYSET. Gilbert U-238 Atomic Energy Lab was the hottest thing to hit toy stores in the 1950s for a hefty price. The toy set cost was $50 because it was actually radioactive. $50 was a steep price to pay back then. Meanwhile, I can spend that in like a day living here. So fortunately, a lot of parents bought more affordable science sets that didn't have radioactive stuff. The toy as a result was discontinued, not because it was actually poisonous, but because no one could afford it. Some say it was safe for children to use as it was very carefully constructed, but put it in the hands of like a 9-year-old boy. Iffy. The Atomic Energy Lab contained a cloud chamber in which you could see alpha particles traveling at 12,000 miles a second. That would be pretty cool. Like if I was that kid and I didn't know what was going on, I totally would be like, Mom, I want that for Christmas. I would have a blast. Pretty impressive, but definitely something rated for kids like 40 and up with maybe a science degree and like a lab suit. Number 8. Perpetual Sunshine. And no, that's not my nickname, but if you want to call me that, go for it. Wouldn't it be cool if we all glowed like Alina in Shadow and Bone? Yeah, it definitely would. But like if someone offers you any kind of radioactive substance, like run, get out of here. Radithor was yet another cure-all remedy said to cure everything under the sun. The deadliest snake oil out there. But I should say we do use radiation today for things like cancer, but we know more or less what we're doing with it now. Radithor was a patent medicine that featured distilled water and 2 isotopes of radium. Perpetual Sunshine in a bottle is what advertisers called it. And it was one of many radioactive elixirs on the market, but sadly, the more a star glows, the faster it burns out. A popular Radithor advocate in 1932 eventually developed holes in his bones, skull, and his entire jaw had to be removed. Still, the man sadly died due to radiation poisoning. So not the miracle cure people thought it was. Unless you didn't like him, that's dark. That's very dark. Okay. Number 7. Thoradia. From cancerous white face powder to radioactive cream, beauty really does kill. I wonder how much of my makeup on my face is slowly killing me. Joke, not a joke. I don't know. Thoradia was another deadly beauty product introduced by a Parisian beauty company that was all the rage. It boasted having thorium and radium lead to help stabilize and promote blood circulation, tone the facial tissues, eliminate fat, and remove wrinkles. Product toured Belgium, Italy, Portugal, Romania, Egypt, and of course, France. Radium's energy was useful as far as creating a natural luminous appearance, but in 1937 the French government put a massive restriction on the sale of products that contained thorium and radium, forcing them to stop using the ingredients. Like, it was almost as if the government was catching on to some not so dewy glow side effects. Beyond cosmetic, the cream was also recommended for scrapes, bruises, herpes, frostbite, you name it. Some clients might not have seen the effects of these chemicals right away, but their later ailments definitely had a relationship to the miracle cure makeup. Number 6. Radioactive shoe sizers. Why use a measuring tape or those like cool metal feet slidey things when you can just use a nuclear bomb? Okay, well, not a nuclear bomb, more like a whole bunch of radioactive materials. I'm honestly just as surprised as you are. I had no idea we were this obsessed with radium for this long. The shoe fitting fluoroscope was a revolutionary new device that changed the way people have their feet measured, because apparently rulers didn't work. Despite scientists getting severely injured during the creation of the device, shoe stores adored it. Parents would take their growing little boys and girls to the counter to have their feet scientifically sized. They put their feet into the X-ray fluoroscope and the salesman and customer would see the bones in their foot. The customers also got a healthy dose of radiation. What a deal! Fortunately though, by the 1950s these machines were recognized as dangerous and slowly banned state by state until 1970s, though Europe continued to use them because they're chic. But decades before bans came into question, the dangers of radiation were already public. In the 1920s, X-ray pioneers suffered very gruesome and very public deaths. Actual data didn't appear until the 1940s and nobody listened until the aforementioned date. But hey, at least they knew they were a size 7.56 over a 7.5 shoe. That's helpful. Number 5. Radioactive toothpaste. Everyone wants to have a smile that lights up a room. Yeah. Radioactive toothpaste. A joy for dentists around the world. So we know by now that people freak out at radium for breakfast because they were convinced it could cure everything, even bad yellow teeth. A German company called Our Company wanted to get out of the steadily building war business, so they came out with thorium toothpaste in order to divert their supplies away from the Yahtzee, evil German people, nuclear initiatives, especially after they knew Germany was going to lose the war. Marketed as the scientific toothpaste, they advertised that the radioactive chemicals will be able to hinder the bacteria in the mouth, which I guess would be technically true, therefore creating healthier teeth. But unfortunately, the opposite was true. Like rotting away. It's awful. Number 4, the TRICHO system. Look, I hate waxing too. I hate it. I've tried it twice, and to this day I refuse to put myself through that kind of pain for a bikini pic. Like, I'm just not gonna do it. It's the worst. I get it, it's a struggle the TRICHO system was eager to solve, and it did, kind of. The TRICHO system was a hair removal device that became a must-have in every hair salon in the 1920s. It would remove hair painlessly. All you had to do was sit at a mahogany desk and face a window. When the flip was switched, there was no burning, just a slight hum from the machine, and boom, no unwanted hairs. Except there were some horrendous side effects. Yes, it would remove the hair, but soon women and men would develop cancerous ulcers, carcinoma, and death. The reason? They were using X-ray technology, which is, as we know, radioactive. It would be administered to the skin for a few times and would require anywhere from 15 to 20 treatments to be effective. When the TRICHO machine was leased out, however, there was no mention of what the technology they used was, and the person administering it wasn't very well qualified either, right? Clients were just marveled that it worked so well until it slowly burned their face off. So bottom line, if someone says anything is a miracle cure, just maybe like scream at them and run. Number 3, the Radium Girls. This story breaks my heart. It's so sad. The Radium Girls became so radioactive that if you stand on their graves today with a Geiger counter, it will still jump like 80 years later. Small town girls from New Jersey were hired by a local factory to paint clock faces of luminous watches. How did they glow, you ask? Well, with glow-in-the-dark radioactive paint. They painted 250 dials on average daily, and in order to ensure that their lines were clean, they would lick the end before dipping it into the paint every few times. They were paid in pennies, around 27 cents per watch today. That's what it kind of breaks down to. So they worked tirelessly, each day swallowing more and more paint. Slowly but surely, the girls were eaten from the inside, their bones dissolving with each stroke of their brush. In the 1920s, 4,000 workers were hired by the US and Canada. The inventor of the glow-in-the-dark paint himself died of radioactive exposure. The first death of the girls, though, was Molly Maggia, died after suffering burning ulcers and agonizing aches, her jawbone dissolved, and so on. The USRC covered it up, saying they weren't responsible, until dozens more died via extreme tumors and horrific other illnesses resulting from the radium. Number 2, Marie Curie. Marie Curie was a brilliant scientist, a pioneer in many ways for women in the field. Her primary accomplishment was expanding our knowledge of radioactivity. But they didn't take any of the precautions we now know to take today. In fact, Marie and her husband Pierre were both buried in lead caskets to contain the radiation they accumulated in their bodies while alive. Even their furniture was radioactive. Marie discovered 2 new elements, radium as I've mentioned, and polonium, and was the first woman to win a Nobel Prize. Using the new discovery of radium, Curie discovered it could be used as the gamma ray source in X-ray technology, advancing the field. She also invented smaller, more portable X-rays that medics could use on the battlefields. However, the Curies overlooked what prolonged exposure to radiation could do. She even used to carry tubes of radium in her pockets. In the 1920s, it finally caught up to her. Her health started to deteriorate rapidly and developed a severe form of leukemia. She passed away on July 4th, 1934. Pierre died years earlier in 1906 from an accident in the street. He was run over by a horse-drawn cart. Because he was so young though, his body held on to more radioactive materials, so his body was actually more radioactive by the end than Marie's was, because by that point it would have run through. Interesting, but terrifying. And last but not least, you knew this was coming, the atom bomb. Hands up if you think every world leader should get rid of their nuclear devices. But they won't, sadly, which is a terrifying thought. After all, no one buys a weapon without having a plan to use it. And if you look at the aftermath of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Well, one of us is going to be next. The bomb at Hiroshima destroyed 2/3 of the city's building in a flash of light and killed 60,000 by the end of 1945. Some were killed directly, others years later due to their injuries. Decades later, survivors of the bombings were still pulling debris from beneath their skin, like little shards of glass, as well as enduring horrific medical conditions like cancer, kidney diseases. The list goes on. 3 days after Hiroshima, they dropped another on Nagasaki. Today, the cities have found new life and would hardly be recognized after 75 years. However, the memories of what happened remain, and how could they forget? Hibakusha is the term used for survivors of both Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and many, like Hiroshi Harada, take action for disarmament and advocate for world peace. Of course they didn't know what we know now, but it sure makes you wonder what we will wish we had known today. Definitely for sure.
Starting off this countdown, we have Fukushima. Due to the Fukushima nuclear disaster, Japan is said to be one of the world's most radioactive places. In 2011, an earthquake triggered a tsunami that ended up flooding the nuclear power plant and knocking out emergency generators. The power plant survived the earthquake, but the tsunami was twice as powerful as the plant was designed to tolerate. It led to the plant's 3 reactors leaking radioactive materials everywhere. The material contaminated wastewater and leaked into the Pacific Ocean. As a result, this is considered the most severe nuclear accident since Chernobyl. To this day, people are still cleaning up the nuclear waste and contaminated water there. In fact, 1.25 million tons of radioactive water is currently being stored at Fukushima. What's scary is that next year they won't be able to store it anymore, so they're looking at releasing it into the sea. Obviously, it will be treated first, but still, it won't be good for the marine life or the water.
Alright, next up at number 9 now, we have the Mediterranean Sea. Now I know what you're thinking, how could this beautiful body of water that separates Europe and Africa be dangerous? It looks lovely. Well, apparently those calm waters are covering what could be one of the biggest nuclear disasters of all time. It's thought that an Italian mafia gang has been secretly dumping nuclear waste there for money since 1994. The extent of how much has been dumped has only recently started to come to light, and some people claim they are still doing it to this day. Either way, there are thought to be hundreds of barrels at the bottom of the sea containing radioactive waste, and if they do break, their contents will devastate the entire region. Incredibly, we're going to be staying with the same Italian mafia now for our number 8, because they've also been doing the exact same thing on the coast of Somalia. Some estimated 600 drum barrels of toxic radioactive waste from all over Europe is thought to have been dumped here by the mafia. It's thought the Somalians' lack of government regulation attracted the criminals, who knew they could probably get away with all of this, and it seems like they pretty much have. In 2004, a tsunami there washed up rusty barrels of toxic waste that seem to date back to the 1990s. Alright, moving on to number 7 now, we have Sellafield in the UK. This nuclear site has produced many tons of radioactive plutonium, but an estimated 1/4 of a ton of the stuff has ended up in the nearby Irish Sea over the years, making it the most radioactive sea on the planet. There have been a number of accidents there, including when radioactive water started spreading into the surrounding land. They finally did manage to plug that leak though, 50 years later. Yeah. Despite plugging that leak, the radioactive waste has actually spread so far that a study done in the 1990s found traces of plutonium in children's teeth from all over the UK. And surprise, surprise, the closer they lived to Sellafield, the more plutonium they had in their teeth. Now, radioactive teeth might sound like some sort of cool new superhero movie, but yeah, it's actually a little bit more dangerous than that. Alright, next up at number 6 now, we have the Mayak Chemical Combine. Back in the 1950s, the Soviet Union set up this site to produce plutonium and uranium for their nuclear weapons program. Now, their method of disposing the radioactive waste from here was basically to just mix it with water and pump it into the nearby river. Now, most of us aren't scientists, but I bet we can all agree that's not a really good idea. Doesn't sound like one. When that started to get too polluted, they then tried to store the waste under a lake, but when a drought evaporated the water, it exposed tons of waste and the winds spread it across 900 square miles. The radiation is thought to have affected about 1 million Russians living nearby, and when the plant was finally closed, the average male lifespan there was just 45 years old. Coming in at number 5 now, it's Meilusu in Kyrgyzstan. Now this site was also set up by the Soviet Union to mine for uranium ore, and it did just that, producing an estimated 10,000 metric tons of the stuff from 1946 to 1948. The radioactive waste rock was then left behind, and it wasn't just 1 or 2 or like 10 rocks, it was about 1.96 million cubic meters of radioactive waste rock. And you know what the worst bit is for the hundreds of thousands of people that lived in that surrounding area? Well, earthquakes happen there, and that radioactive rock ends up all over the place. In fact, in 2005, 300,000 cubic meters of it fell into a nearby river. Nasty, nasty stuff. But it's not all that bad, guys, because they did manage to make a few nuclear bombs out of all of this. So, yay. Moving on to number 4 now, we have the Polygon in Kazakhstan. Now you're not going to believe this, guys, but hold on, guess who built this? The Soviet Union. I know, mental. The Polygon is where the Soviet Union tested its nuclear weapons, and by testing, I mean they blew up nuclear bombs right there. Over the 40 years from 1949 to 1989, they tested their first nuclear bomb here and liked it so much they went on to drop 455 more. Now this site was chosen to become a nuclear wasteland because they said it was uninhabited, despite an estimated 700,000 people living there. Well, perhaps it was the Soviet Union's goal to make it uninhabited, because an estimated 200,000 people have now had their health damaged by the leftover radiation. Alright, coming in at number 3 now, we have the Siberian Chemical Combine in Russia, which was actually set up by the French. I'm just kidding, of course, obviously it's the Soviet Union. Now they produced materials for nuclear weapons for almost 40 years before being turned into a storage site for radioactive material. On April 6, 1993, a tank that contained a radioactive mixture exploded. It destroyed a large part of the building, and the toxic gas was quickly spread by the wind over 200 square kilometers. As for the rest of the waste there, well, an estimated 125,000 tons of it are just sitting there, uncovered, and the radiation is thought to be spreading into the frozen land around, to the point where the icy temperatures and the wild animals of Siberia probably aren't the only thing that could kill you. Alright, next up at number 2 now, we have a very famous site on our list. It's Chernobyl in Ukraine. Now this was the site of the worst nuclear power plant accident in history. Due to very poor design features and lack of safety procedures, the Chernobyl nuclear power plant entered a complete meltdown on Saturday the 26th of April 1986. The explosion caused a huge cloud of radioactive smoke to drift over most of Europe. The fire was eventually put out and the smoke did eventually dissipate, but the site of the explosion has remained highly radioactive ever since. Tens of thousands of people were evacuated from the area, leaving it a pretty much radioactive ghost town. The International Nuclear Event Scale ranks disasters like this from level 1 up to level 7. The Chernobyl disaster is one of only 2 events in the world to be classified at level 7. The other is actually our number 1 most radioactive place on Earth, Fukushima in Japan. On March the 11th, 2011, an earthquake off the coast of Japan caused a tsunami that hit the Fukushima nuclear power plant. The 13-meter high wave flooded the generators that were providing power to the plant's cooling system. Now with no cooling system, the reactors began to overheat until 3 out of 6 of them entered a full-blown meltdown. The radiation began pouring out of the facility and into the nearby sea. In total, it's thought that the level of radiation released was more than 100 times the amount than both of the nuclear bombs that were dropped on Japan at the end of World War II. An estimated 6 million people were exposed to this radiation, and this isn't just some sort of story from a history book either. Even as you watch this, Japan is still fighting to contain this horrific nuclear accident from harming life for hundreds of miles around.